So let's look at analysing qualitative data thematically, and we're going to start off by looking at what we actually do in the field. And in the field, we actually look at our data and we think as we analyse it, we start thinking, I wonder if, or is there a pattern there? And we call this reflective or iterative field analysis. And that's not the main topic of what we're talking about today. Similarly, the stage of immersing ourselves in our data after we've collected it, so reading transcripts, watching videos or whatever, actually listening, watching or transcribing and immersing our data. We're not going to cover that today, but that's also important as we familiarise ourselves with our data. The key aspect of what we're covering today is the issue of identifying themes, and within this we're going to be talking about, do we do it inductively, in other words, do we build our themes out of the data, or do we do it deductively? So in effect we use the literature to provide us with themes and then we test those qualitatively. We're also going to spend a little bit of time looking at the analysing these themes. In other words, developing and testing propositions. And here we'll be thinking and linking back to the inductive and deductive identification themes, because if we're doing it inductively, we'll actually be theory building, and if we're doing it deductively, we'd be theory testing. So let's start by thinking about how do we complete jigsaw puzzles. And Ian Day has a beautiful quote which I've reproduced on this slide, where he says, there are some pieces of a puzzle which are so unique that we can see straight away their place in the picture. These exceptions apart, classification is the key to the process. Before I can fit a piece into the puzzle, I have to assess the characteristics and assign it to some category or another. So let's look at how we would complete a jigsaw puzzle. And obviously the first thing we do is we tip the pieces out of the puzzle box or puzzle bag. And if that had a picture on it, we could use that as analogous to a substantive theory. So a theory that's restricted to a particular time, a particular group or research setting. In other words, this particular jigsaw, and a picture represents the theory. The next thing we do is we turn them all face up, and we need to decide what are the relevant units we're going to actually use for attaching our codes, for actually looking at our themes within this. And so what we'd be doing here is we'd be attaching our codes to an individual jigsaw piece. The next thing we do is having decided to categorise the pieces, we would actually start to look probably for the initial categories of edges, corners, and then putting all the other pieces together. And now what we're doing is we're bringing in a wider range of data in an understanding about the jigsaw puzzle we've had before. So we're bringing in a broader theory, or what we would call a middle range theory. And this middle range theory says something like categories of edges and corners are useful in helping us complete jigsaw puzzles. So this is a much more broad theory. It's like a host of substantive theories that present similar propositions and may lead, in effect, by doing this, to middle range theories. So if we looked at lots of jigsaw puzzles, we would know, with few exceptions, that corners and edges are a good place to start. Having done that, we'd actually start to build the edges, starting at the corners and then moving across. So as we do that, we look at how the pieces fit together. And so pieces which we could actually say code, for example, as vegetation and sky, would show the link between the vegetation and the sky. And so we've got a piece just on the left-hand side which has vegetation and sky, so we can see how it's going to link down to bottom, and then the edges going in and the shape as well. So we're building a number of different categories together with that. And as we can see, eventually we would be able to complete the edges of our jigsaw puzzle. You probably noticed when we were doing the previous slide, we were looking at edges and we were looking at corners, but we also started to talk about what the pieces actually had on them in terms of pictures, and we were using codes like sky and foliage or green. Now we're going to actually develop and refine these categories to represent all pieces meaningfully, and when we say refine, we're making them in more detail. So we'd start off perhaps with the sky piece and say, well, there's some with cloud and there's some with no cloud. Perhaps then we look at trees and say, well, we'll just leave it as tree as a code. We won't go into more detail whether or not there's different shapes of leaves, for example. Then we go into the building, and we may say, rather than just saying buildings, we might say, well, there's buildings which have stone on them, there's buildings which have brick on, and there's buildings where we see windows. And so we might categorise the pieces in terms of having each of those features of buildings. Remembering, of course, that when we actually categorise pieces, we can place them in 2 or more categories or give them 2 or more themes. The next thing we do is we move on and we look at how we can actually put each unit or each piece into a number of themes. So it might be at the top level of codes, sky, tree and building. We might say, well, that piece is sky and tree, for example, or that piece is sky and building. Then what we'd be starting to do is looking at the relationships between the themes and the patterns that we can get out of that. So the relationship of likely how do the trees and the sky relate to each other. And this reveals the relationship between the pieces. And we can see this starting to come together in the picture. And by looking at the relationships between the pieces, using the codes we've made and looking for the themes about the sky is at the top end of the picture, there's a tree in the right hand side, and so on, and the relationship between the sky and the buildings, we can actually start to complete the puzzle. So we might, in effect, have done there, developed a proposition, and the proposition is the sky is at the top of the picture, the green foliage is at the bottom of the picture, and the building is set against the sky. And those could be 3 propositions which reveal the relationship between the pieces. And by doing that, we'd be able to complete the entire puzzle, and we can see this completed here. So let's look at this process that we were doing when we were making the jigsaw on the left hand side in terms of coding and compare it with the thematic analysis process we go through. And at the first stage, in making the jigsaw, we tip the pieces out and we turn them face up. And so we were immersing ourselves and familiarising ourselves with the data, something we do by reading transcripts, for example, or for looking at images if we're using visual data. Then we decided that the best units to use for our data was pieces. Now, when we're looking at transcripts, we might say the best data unit is a sentence, or it might be a response from the interviewee versus the question from the respondent. So it might be an utterance in terms of an answer, or it might be a line of data. It's a bit of trial and error, but we have to work out what's going to work best. Once we've did that in making our jigsaw, we took some initial categories. In this case, they were edges, corners and others. And from this, we were able to build the edges of the puzzle starting at the corners. So these are ones which are really obvious. In qualitative data analysis, you're doing template analysis, we attach our initial categories to data and start to identify possible emerging themes. We then, building our jigsaw, developed and refined categories to represent all the pieces meaningfully. And in effect, what we're doing when we're doing qualitative data analysis, using thematic analysis, is we're developing and refining the categories to represent the meaningful themes in our data. And again, this will be an iterative process working backwards and forwards. A bit like it is with the jigsaw, when you try a piece to see if it fits there because it has the right colour and it has the right bit of tree and a bit of sky or building, and it doesn't quite fit. So it's an iterative process. And then finally, we analysed the themes and patterns we'd identified to reveal the relationship between the puzzle pieces, and that enabled us to complete the puzzle. Within qualitative analysis, when we're doing thematic analysis, we analyse the themes and patterns identified to try and understand what's going on. In other words, to uncover meanings within our data. So let's look at what we've actually been doing. We started off by categorising our data. We developed meaningful themes, and these meaningful themes can, when we're doing qualitative analysis, either be terms or ideas that emerge inductively from our data, or they can emerge in terms and be the actual terms used by respondents or participants, and we call these in vivo codes. Or the other way we could do it is perhaps using, like we did with the picture on the box, they could be terms used in existing theory or literature. We then attach these themes, the codes, to relevant units, and in this case we're attaching them to jigsaw puzzle pieces, but they, as we said before, they could be lines of data, sentences of data, paragraphs, etc. And it's an interactive process, and as you saw, we can actually develop a hierarchical level of codes. And the process we've been doing is called thematic analysis. It's the process of identifying themes and patterns in data and analysing these to uncover meanings. In terms of references and further reading, Braun and Clark's book, Thematic Analysis: A Practical Guide, is an excellent guide to undertaking thematic analysis. I cannot recommend it highly enough. In relation to these slides, section 1 provides a brilliant overview of how to undertake thematic analysis. Day's book, Qualitative Data Analysis, provides an overview of thematic analysis in chapter 3, and it gives a bit more detail in chapters 8 and 9, and that's where that quote came with the jigsaw puzzle, the motorcycle on it. And finally, my book with Phil and Adrian, Research Methods of Business Students, gives insights into the different types of theory in chapter 2, and in chapter 13 we talk about thematic analysis as well and different ways of doing so. I hope you found this YouTube video presentation useful, and I'd be really grateful if you'd subscribe to my channel, Mark Saunders on Research Methods, and also told your friends and colleagues about the channel as well. I'm adding new videos to the channel nearly every week, and hopefully they'll be of help to you in your own research.